Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we least expect them. In a world where technology dominates our connections and genuine emotions seem harder to find, two souls connected through 88 black and white keys in a way that reminded everyone watching what it truly means to be human. This is not just a story about music. This is a story about a grandmother who refused to let her granddaughter's dreams die, even when the world seemed determined to crush them. This is about the moment when love transcended words, when melody became medicine, and when a simple piano bench became the bridge between generations, healing wounds that had festered for years. What happened that evening didn't just move hearts, it changed lives forever. Catherine Williams had always believed that some bonds were unbreakable, even when life tried its hardest to sever them. At 73 years old, she sat in her small apartment overlooking the busy streets of downtown Portland, her weathered hands tracing the dust that had accumulated on her old, upright piano. The instrument had been silent for nearly 2 years now, ever since the incident that had torn her family apart and left her granddaughter Charlotte living 3 states away with her father. The morning light streamed through her lace curtains, illuminating the framed photographs that lined the piano's surface. Most of them featured a young girl with bright green eyes and auburn curls, sitting at this very piano with her fingers poised over the keys. Charlotte had been just 5 years old when Catherine first introduced her to music, and by age 10, she was already playing pieces that brought tears to the eyes of anyone who listened. The child had possessed something special, something that couldn't be taught or learned from books. She had music in her very soul. Catherine's daughter, Margaret, had never understood this gift. She saw Charlotte's passion for music as an impractical distraction from more important things like mathematics, science, and preparing for a stable career. The arguments between mother and daughter had grown more frequent and more heated as Charlotte approached her teenage years. Margaret wanted her daughter to focus on academics, to follow a path that would guarantee financial security. She couldn't understand why anyone would waste time on something as uncertain as music. The final blow had come 2 years ago, just after Charlotte's 13th birthday. Margaret had discovered that Catherine had been secretly paying for Charlotte's advanced piano lessons and had even started a college fund specifically for music school. The confrontation had been devastating. Words were spoken that couldn't be taken back. Accusations were made that cut deep into old wounds. And by the time the dust settled, Margaret had packed up her belongings and Charlotte's things and moved across the country to Colorado, where her ex-husband lived. Catherine hadn't seen Charlotte since that terrible day. Phone calls were monitored and brief. Video calls were forbidden. Margaret had made it clear that Catherine's influence on Charlotte was no longer welcome, and any attempts to encourage the girl's musical aspirations would result in a complete cutting of ties. Catherine had been forced to watch from a distance as her granddaughter's light slowly dimmed, as the spark that had once burned so brightly began to fade under the weight of expectations and restrictions. The old woman rose from her chair and walked to the window, watching as people hurried past on the sidewalk below. Each of them had their own stories, their own dreams, their own heartaches. She wondered how many of them had been forced to give up something they loved. How many had been told that their passions weren't practical or worthwhile. The world seemed to have lost its appreciation for beauty, for the things that made life worth living beyond mere survival. Catherine's own musical journey had begun in childhood, much like Charlotte's. Her mother had been a piano teacher, and their small house had always been filled with the sounds of scales, etudes, and classical pieces. Catherine had shown promise, enough that her teacher had suggested she pursue music seriously. But that was in 1945, and women of her generation were expected to marry young and focus on family. Her dreams of performing had been set aside when she met Robert Williams at a church social when she was 19. Robert had been a good man, supportive and kind, but he had never truly understood her need for music. He tolerated her playing, even enjoyed it sometimes, but he saw it as a pleasant hobby rather than an essential part of who she was. When their daughter Margaret was born 3 years later, Catherine's piano was relegated to stolen moments after household chores were done, and the baby was asleep. As the years passed, and life became more demanding, those moments became fewer and fewer. It wasn't until Margaret had children of her own that Catherine rediscovered her love for music. When Charlotte was born, Catherine saw an opportunity to share something precious with a new generation. She began playing lullabies for the baby, simple melodies that seemed to calm Charlotte in a way that nothing else could. As Charlotte grew older, she would climb onto Catherine's lap during piano practice, her tiny fingers reaching for the keys, trying to mimic the sounds her grandmother made. The first time Charlotte played a complete piece on her own, she was 7 years old. It was Für Elise by Beethoven, a piece that Catherine had taught her slowly, one phrase at a time over several months. When Charlotte's small fingers finally played the entire composition without stopping, both grandmother and granddaughter had tears in their eyes. It was a moment of pure magic, a connection that transcended age and experience. Catherine knew in that instant that Charlotte had inherited something special, something that needed to be nurtured and protected. For the next 6 years, Catherine and Charlotte shared a musical journey that became the cornerstone of their relationship. Every weekend, Charlotte would visit her grandmother, and they would spend hours at the piano together. Catherine taught her technique and theory, but more importantly, she taught her to feel the music, to understand that each piece told a story and carried emotions that could touch the human heart in profound ways. Charlotte progressed rapidly, moving from simple children's songs to complex classical pieces with an ease that amazed her teachers. Her small hands could somehow manage the stretches and intricate fingerwork that challenged students twice her age. But it wasn't just her technical ability that impressed people. When Charlotte played, something magical happened. The music seemed to flow through her rather than from her, as if she were a conduit for something greater than herself. The turning point in their relationship with Margaret had come when Charlotte expressed a desire to audition for a prestigious music academy. She was 12 years old and already playing at a level that would qualify her for advanced study. Catherine had been thrilled, seeing it as validation of everything they had worked toward together. But Margaret had been horrified. She saw it as Catherine filling Charlotte's head with unrealistic dreams and setting her up for disappointment and financial instability. The arguments that followed had been painful and destructive. Margaret accused Catherine of being selfish, of living vicariously through Charlotte instead of allowing the child to make her own decisions. Catherine tried to explain that music wasn't something she was imposing on Charlotte, but rather something that flowed naturally from the girl's heart. But Margaret couldn't see it that way. In her mind, Catherine was leading Charlotte down a path that would only result in struggle and disappointment. Now, 2 years later, Catherine lived with the consequences of that conflict every day. She had no idea if Charlotte was still playing piano, if she even had access to an instrument. The few times they had spoken on the phone, Charlotte had seemed subdued, careful about what she said, clearly aware that her mother was listening. The vibrant, passionate child who had once filled Catherine's apartment with laughter and music had been replaced by someone cautious and restrained. Catherine walked back to the piano and lifted the bench cover, revealing the sheet music they had been working on together before everything changed. It was Chopin's Minute Waltz, a piece that Charlotte had been determined to master for her 13th birthday. They had been so close to perfecting it when Margaret's discovery of the secret lessons had brought everything crashing down. The music still bore Charlotte's penciled notes in the margins, reminders about fingering and tempo that they had written together during their last lesson. As Catherine sat at the piano bench, her fingers found the familiar keys almost automatically. The opening notes of the Minute Waltz filled the quiet apartment, bringing with them a flood of memories. She could almost hear Charlotte's voice counting the rhythm, could almost feel the girl's presence beside her on the bench. The music had been their language, their way of communicating things that words couldn't express. It had been their bridge across the gap between generations, their shared passion that made everything else fade away. The piece was challenging, requiring both technical skill and emotional sensitivity. Catherine's fingers weren't as nimble as they once had been, but the muscle memory was still there, along with the deep understanding of how the music should flow. As she played, she thought about Charlotte and wondered if the girl remembered this piece, if she ever thought about the hours they had spent working on it together. When Catherine finished playing, the apartment seemed even quieter than before. The silence that followed music was always different from ordinary quiet, charged with the echoes of what had just been expressed. She closed the piano lid gently and returned to her chair by the window, but her mind remained focused on the music and the memories it had stirred. The afternoon passed slowly, as most of Catherine's days did now. She tried to stay busy with reading, cooking, and light housework, but her thoughts kept returning to Charlotte. She wondered what the girl was doing at that moment, whether she was happy, whether she still loved music the way she once had. The uncertainty was perhaps the hardest part of their separation. Not knowing was worse than knowing something difficult or painful. As evening approached, Catherine prepared a simple dinner and sat at her small kitchen table. The apartment felt too quiet without the sound of music, too empty without the energy and joy that Charlotte had always brought to it. She found herself looking at the clock, remembering how she used to count the hours until Charlotte's weekend visits, how the anticipation would build throughout the week. After dinner, Catherine sat in her favorite armchair with a cup of tea and picked up a book she had been reading. But the words on the page couldn't hold her attention. Her mind kept drifting to the piano, to the music that remained trapped inside it, waiting for the right hands to set it free. She thought about all the pieces Charlotte had never gotten to learn, all the musical experiences they would never share if Margaret's position remained unchanged. The phone rang just as Catherine was getting ready for bed, startling her from her melancholy thoughts. She hurried to answer it, hoping against hope that it might be Charlotte calling, even though she knew Margaret would never allow such a thing. Instead, she heard her neighbor Mrs. Patterson's concerned voice asking if she was all right. "I heard piano music earlier," Mrs. Patterson explained. "It was beautiful, but it sounded so sad. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." Catherine thanked her neighbor for the concern and assured her that she was fine. But after hanging up the phone, she realized that Mrs. Patterson was right. The music had been sad, filled with all the longing and regret that Catherine carried in her heart. Music had always been honest that way, incapable of hiding true emotions no matter how hard one might try. As she turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, Catherine found herself making a silent promise. Somehow, some way, she would find a path back to Charlotte. She would not let their musical bond be broken forever. There had to be a way to bridge the gap that Margaret had created, a way to show her daughter that music wasn't the enemy she believed it to be. Love this strong didn't simply disappear because of distance and disagreement. It endured, waiting for the right moment to resurface and reconnect two hearts that belonged together. The last thing Catherine saw before closing her eyes was the moonlight streaming across her piano, illuminating the keys that held so many memories and so much hope for the future. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, and Catherine would be ready to embrace whatever chance might come her way to rebuild the relationship that meant everything to her. In her dreams that night, Catherine heard Charlotte playing again, her music filling the apartment with joy and life. It was a dream worth holding on to, a dream that would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead. The music lived on in both their hearts, and music, Catherine knew, had a way of finding its way back home. 3 months had passed since Catherine's sleepless night of musical memories when an unexpected phone call changed everything. She was watering her small collection of houseplants on a Tuesday morning when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar but warm, introducing herself as Linda Morrison, a social worker from Denver, Colorado. "Mrs. Williams," Linda began carefully, "I'm calling about your granddaughter Charlotte. I understand there's been some family tension, but I need you to know that Charlotte has been struggling quite a bit lately. Her father contacted our office because he's concerned about her emotional well-being." Catherine's heart raced as she set down her watering can and gripped the phone tighter. She hadn't heard Charlotte's father's name, David, spoken in their family for years. After the divorce, Margaret had made it clear that any mention of him was unwelcome, even though he had always been a kind and supportive father to Charlotte. "What kind of struggling?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Linda explained that Charlotte had been exhibiting signs of depression since moving to Colorado. Her grades had dropped significantly, she had withdrawn from social activities, and, most concerning of all, she had stopped eating regularly. David had tried various approaches to help his daughter, including counseling, but Charlotte remained largely unresponsive to treatment. She spent most of her time in her room, barely speaking to anyone. During one of her therapy sessions, Linda continued, Charlotte mentioned that she used to play piano with her grandmother. When the therapist asked about it, Charlotte broke down completely. It was the first real emotional response they'd gotten from her in months. The therapist believes that reconnecting with music might be key to helping Charlotte recover. Catherine felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had suspected that Charlotte might be struggling, but hearing it confirmed was heartbreaking. The vibrant, joyful child she remembered seemed so far away from the depressed teenager Linda was describing. "What exactly are you asking of me?" Catherine inquired, though her heart was already racing with possibilities. Linda explained that David was requesting Catherine's help, despite knowing it would likely cause conflict with Margaret. He felt that Charlotte's well-being was more important than maintaining family peace. The social worker had convinced Margaret to allow a supervised visit, though she had agreed reluctantly and with strict conditions. "Margaret has agreed to let Charlotte spend 1 week with you," Linda said. "But there are rules. Charlotte is not to take any music lessons during the visit. She's not to be enrolled in any musical programs. This is meant to be a therapeutic visit focused on family connection, not music instruction." Catherine's heart sank at the restrictions, but she immediately agreed to the terms. Any chance to see Charlotte was better than no chance at all. They arranged for Charlotte to visit the following month, and Linda promised to call with flight details as soon as everything was finalized. After hanging up the phone, Catherine sat in stunned silence for several minutes. The news was both wonderful and terrifying. She would finally see Charlotte again, but the girl she was about to meet was clearly very different from the happy child she remembered. The weight of responsibility felt enormous. What if she couldn't help? What if Charlotte had changed too much? What if the musical connection they had shared was gone forever? Over the next few weeks, Catherine threw herself into preparing for Charlotte's visit. She cleaned the apartment from top to bottom, stocked the kitchen with all of Charlotte's favorite foods, and even bought new bedding for the guest room. But the most difficult decision involved the piano. Should she leave it uncovered and accessible, or should she respect Margaret's wishes and keep it closed? After much deliberation, Catherine decided to leave the piano as it always was. Music had been such an integral part of their relationship that hiding it seemed dishonest. She wouldn't encourage Charlotte to play if the girl didn't want to, but she wouldn't hide their shared passion either. The day of Charlotte's arrival, Catherine was a bundle of nerves. She had barely slept the night before, worrying about how different Charlotte might be, how strained their interaction might feel after 2 years of separation. When the taxi pulled up outside her building, Catherine's hands were shaking as she buzzed Charlotte up to the apartment. The young woman who walked through Catherine's door was almost unrecognizable. At 15, Charlotte had grown several inches taller, but she seemed to have lost weight rather than gained it. Her once bright green eyes looked dull and distant, and her beautiful auburn hair hung limp around her shoulders. She wore oversized clothes that seemed to swallow her thin frame, and she moved with the slow, deliberate steps of someone much older. "Hello, Grandma," Charlotte said quietly, her voice barely audible. Catherine wanted to rush forward and embrace her granddaughter, but something in Charlotte's posture warned her to be gentle. Instead, she approached slowly and opened her arms, allowing Charlotte to decide whether to accept the hug. After a moment's hesitation, Charlotte stepped forward and allowed herself to be held, though her body remained stiff and unresponsive. "I'm so glad you're here," Catherine whispered, fighting back tears. "I've missed you more than you can possibly imagine." Charlotte's response was a barely perceptible nod. She seemed to be looking everywhere except at her grandmother's face, as if direct eye contact was too painful or difficult. When her gaze finally landed on the piano, she stopped moving entirely. For a long moment, she stared at the instrument as if it were a ghost from another life. "I see you still have the piano," Charlotte said, her voice carefully neutral. "Yes," Catherine replied simply. "Would you like to sit down? I made your favorite cookies yesterday." The first few days of the visit were challenging. Charlotte was polite but distant, responding to questions with short answers, and spending long periods staring out the window or reading quietly in her room. She ate very little despite Catherine's attempts to tempt her with favorite foods, and she seemed to tire easily, napping frequently throughout the day. Catherine tried various activities to engage her granddaughter. They went for walks in the park where Charlotte had played as a child, visited the library where they used to check out books together, and even went to see a movie. But nothing seemed to spark any real interest or enthusiasm. Charlotte participated in these activities mechanically, as if she were going through the motions of normal behavior without actually feeling anything. The piano remained a silent presence in the apartment. Charlotte never approached it, never touched it, never even seemed to look at it directly. But Catherine noticed that whenever she was in the living room, Charlotte positioned herself where she could see the instrument in her peripheral vision. It was as if she was aware of it constantly, but didn't dare to acknowledge it openly. On the fourth evening of the visit, Catherine was washing dishes after dinner when she heard a sound that made her heart skip a beat. Someone was touching the piano keys, just barely pressing them down enough to produce the faintest whisper of sound. She turned around to see Charlotte standing beside the piano bench, her fingers resting lightly on the keys of the upper register. Catherine didn't say anything, afraid that speaking might break whatever spell was drawing Charlotte toward the music. She continued washing dishes, pretending not to notice, while Charlotte's fingers explored the familiar keyboard. After a few minutes, Charlotte pressed down on middle C, allowing the full tone to ring out in the quiet apartment. The sound seemed to startle Charlotte herself. She jerked her hand away from the keys as if they had burned her and quickly returned to her chair across the room. But something had shifted. For the first time since arriving, Charlotte seemed truly present, truly engaged with her surroundings. "The piano sounds good," Charlotte said quietly. "You've kept it in tune." "I have a tuner come every few months," Catherine replied, trying to keep her voice casual. It seemed important to maintain it properly, even though no one plays it anymore. Catherine turned from the sink to look directly at her granddaughter. "I play it sometimes," she said honestly. "Not as well as I used to. But I couldn't bear to let it sit silent forever." Charlotte nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied something inside her. They didn't speak about the piano again that evening, but Catherine noticed that Charlotte's demeanor had changed slightly. She seemed less withdrawn, more aware of her surroundings. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Catherine woke to the sound of someone moving around in the living room very early before dawn. She slipped out of bed and crept to her bedroom door, listening carefully. What she heard made her catch her breath. Someone was playing the piano, very softly, barely loud enough to be heard. Catherine opened her door a crack and peered into the living room. Charlotte was sitting at the piano bench in her pajamas, her hands moving carefully over the keys. She was playing Clair de Lune by Debussy, a piece they had worked on together years ago. But she was playing it so quietly that the sound was more felt than heard, as if she were trying to keep the music secret even from herself. Catherine watched for several minutes as Charlotte played through pieces from their shared repertoire. Her technique was still beautiful, perhaps even more refined than Catherine remembered, but there was something different about the way she approached the music. Where once her playing had been joyful and expansive, now it seemed careful and contained, as if she were afraid to let the music fully express itself. When Charlotte finished playing, she sat motionless at the piano for a long time, her hands resting in her lap. Catherine could see her shoulders shaking slightly and realized that her granddaughter was crying. The sight broke Catherine's heart, but she remained hidden, sensing that Charlotte needed this private moment with the music. Eventually, Charlotte returned to her room, moving so quietly that Catherine might not have known she had been up if she hadn't witnessed it herself. When they met for breakfast later that morning, neither of them mentioned what had happened, but Catherine noticed that Charlotte seemed different. Some of the tension had left her posture, and she made more direct eye contact than she had since arriving. Over the next 2 days, the early morning piano sessions continued. Each time, Charlotte played more freely, allowing the music to grow gradually louder and more expressive. Catherine continued to listen secretly, not wanting to intrude on what seemed to be a delicate process of reconnection. The pieces Charlotte chose told a story of their own. She began with simple, melancholy compositions, gradually working her way toward more complex and emotionally demanding works. Catherine recognized some of them as pieces they had studied together, but others were new, suggesting that Charlotte had continued learning music even after moving to Colorado, despite her mother's restrictions. On Charlotte's 6th morning at the apartment, Catherine made a decision that would change everything. Instead of staying hidden in her room, she quietly joined Charlotte at the piano. She didn't say anything, simply sat beside her granddaughter on the bench and placed her hands on the lower keys. Charlotte looked surprised but didn't move away. Without speaking, they began to play together, Catherine taking the bass line, while Charlotte continued with the melody. It was Heart and Soul, the first duet they had ever learned together when Charlotte was 7 years old. Their fingers remembered the familiar pattern, and gradually they fell into the rhythm they had perfected years ago. When the song ended, both women had tears in their eyes. Charlotte looked at her grandmother directly for the first time since arriving and whispered, "I've missed this so much." "So have I," Catherine replied, reaching over to stroke Charlotte's hair. "Music is who you are, sweetheart. It's not something that can be taken away from you." Charlotte began to cry then, really cry, with deep sobs that seemed to release 2 years of suppressed emotion. Catherine held her granddaughter while she wept, understanding that this was part of the healing process that Linda Morrison had hoped for. "I'm so confused, Grandma," Charlotte said through her tears. "Mom says music will ruin my life, that I need to focus on practical things. But when I don't play, I feel like I'm dying inside. I don't know who I am without music." Catherine chose her words carefully, knowing how important this moment was. "Music isn't something you choose, Charlotte. It's something that chooses you. Some people are called to be doctors or teachers or engineers, and that's wonderful. But you were called to be a musician. Fighting against that calling is what's making you so unhappy." They talked for hours that morning about music and dreams and the courage required to follow one's passion despite opposition. Catherine shared stories from her own youth, about the musical dreams she had set aside and the regret she had carried for decades. She told Charlotte about the joy she had found in sharing music with her, how teaching her granddaughter had reawakened her own love for the art form. "But what about Mom?" Charlotte asked. "She'll never understand. She thinks I'm throwing my life away." "Your mother loves you," Catherine said gently. "She's afraid for you because she doesn't understand what music means to people like us. Her fear makes her believe that pursuing music is risky and impractical. But love and fear sometimes make people do things that hurt the people they're trying to protect." As Charlotte's visit neared its end, Catherine knew she had to make a difficult decision. The transformation in Charlotte over the past few days had been remarkable. The withdrawn, depressed teenager who had arrived was beginning to show glimpses of the vibrant young woman she was meant to be. But Catherine also knew that sending Charlotte back to a situation where her musical nature was suppressed would likely undo all the progress they had made. That evening, Catherine called Linda Morrison and explained what had happened during the visit. She described Charlotte's depression, her early morning piano sessions, and the breakthrough they had experienced together. Most importantly, she shared her conviction that Charlotte's mental health was directly connected to her ability to express herself musically. "I know this wasn't supposed to be about music," Catherine said, "but I can't ignore what I've seen this week. This child is suffering because she's being denied something essential to her nature. Something needs to change, or I'm afraid we're going to lose her completely." Linda listened carefully and promised to discuss the situation with Charlotte's therapist and father. She agreed that the improvement in Charlotte's mood and behavior was significant and needed to be taken seriously when planning her future treatment. On Charlotte's last morning, they sat at the piano together one final time. This time, Charlotte chose to play the Minute Waltz, the piece they had been working on when everything fell apart. Her performance was flawless, filled with all the technical skill and emotional depth that had been developing during their time together. When she finished, Charlotte turned to her grandmother and said, "I want to audition for music school. I know it will cause problems with Mom, but I can't pretend anymore that I want something different. This is who I am." Catherine felt her heart swell with pride and hope. "Then, we'll find a way to make that happen," she promised. "No matter what it takes." As they prepared for Charlotte's departure, both grandmother and granddaughter knew that their week together had changed everything. The musical connection that had once defined their relationship had been restored, but more than that, Charlotte had rediscovered her own identity and purpose. The real challenge would come next, as they worked together to convince Margaret that supporting Charlotte's musical dreams was the key to her happiness and mental health. The taxi that would take Charlotte to the airport was waiting outside, but neither of them was ready to say goodbye. They had been given a gift of time and music, and now they had to trust that what they had rebuilt together was strong enough to survive whatever challenges lay ahead. "Remember," Catherine said as she hugged Charlotte one last time, "music lives in your heart. No one can take that away from you. And whenever you play, wherever you are, I'll be listening." Charlotte nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for saving me, Grandma. I was so lost. But you helped me find my way back to myself." As the taxi pulled away, Catherine stood at her window watching until it disappeared around the corner. The apartment felt quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. It was the peaceful silence that follows beautiful music, charged with possibility and hope. The piano sat waiting, ready for whatever came next, knowing that its voice would soon be heard again in ways that would touch hearts and change lives. The weeks following Charlotte's departure were filled with a flurry of phone calls, emails, and tense conversations that stretched across 3 states and involved social workers, therapists, lawyers, and family members who hadn't spoken in years. Catherine found herself at the center of a storm she hadn't anticipated, fighting for her granddaughter's future while navigating the complex web of family dynamics that had been tangled for far too long. Margaret's reaction to the reports from Charlotte's visit had been explosive. She felt betrayed by David's decision to involve Catherine, angry at the social workers for what she saw as interference in her parenting, and furious with Charlotte for what she perceived as manipulation and drama. The phone call between Margaret and Catherine 3 days after Charlotte's return to Colorado had been devastating. "You had no right," Margaret had screamed into the phone, her voice breaking with emotion. "You deliberately went against my wishes and filled Charlotte's head with those same impossible dreams. Now she's refusing to eat again, crying constantly, and demanding to move back to Oregon with you. You've made everything worse." Catherine had tried to explain what she had witnessed during Charlotte's visit, the gradual emergence of the real girl from beneath the depression that had been consuming her. But Margaret wasn't ready to hear that Charlotte's problems might be connected to the restrictions on her musical expression. In Margaret's mind, music was still the problem, not the solution. "She needs to face reality," Margaret had continued. "She's 15 years old, and it's time she learned that life isn't about following dreams and feeling good all the time. She needs to prepare for a real career, something that will actually support her when she's an adult." The conversation had ended badly, with Margaret hanging up after threatening to cut off all contact if Catherine continued to undermine her parenting. For several days afterward, Catherine had been unable to reach Charlotte at all, her calls going straight to voicemail. But David had quietly been working behind the scenes. Charlotte's depression had returned full force after leaving Portland, and this time it was accompanied by concerning behaviors that even Margaret couldn't ignore. Charlotte had stopped attending school regularly, claimed to be sick most days, and spent entire days in bed. The therapist David had found for Charlotte had documented significant regression and was now recommending more intensive treatment. Dr. Sarah Chun was a specialist in adolescent mental health who had been working with Charlotte since her return from Portland. Unlike previous therapists, Dr. Chun had taken the time to research music therapy and its applications for depression and creative adolescence. Her conversations with Linda Morrison about Charlotte's transformation during her grandmother's visit had convinced her that a different approach was needed. "Charlotte is suffering from what we might call soul depression," Dr. Chin explained to David during one of their private consultations. "This isn't just typical teenage mood swings or academic stress. She's experiencing a fundamental disconnect from her core identity. When someone with Charlotte's level of musical talent and passion is forced to suppress that part of themselves, it can create a depression that's resistant to traditional treatment." Dr. Chin had recommended that Charlotte be allowed to return to music as part of her therapy, but Margaret had refused to consider it. This led to Dr. Chun taking the unusual step of filing a formal recommendation with the family court system, suggesting that Charlotte's mental health was being endangered by the current restrictions on her musical expression. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and emotionally draining for everyone involved. Margaret felt that her authority as a parent was being challenged by outsiders who didn't understand their family situation. David found himself caught between his concern for Charlotte's well-being and his desire to maintain a peaceful co-parenting relationship with Margaret. Catherine worried constantly about Charlotte while trying to navigate the legal system she had never expected to be involved with. Charlotte herself was struggling to understand why something that brought her so much joy and felt so natural could be causing such conflict in her family. During her sessions with Dr. Chun, she talked about feeling guilty for having musical talent, as if it were some kind of character flaw that was hurting the people she loved. "I keep thinking maybe Mom is right," Charlotte told Dr. Chun during one of their sessions. "Maybe I'm being selfish and unrealistic. Maybe I should just forget about music and focus on the things she wants me to focus on." Dr. Chun had gently challenged this thinking, helping Charlotte understand that denying her authentic self wouldn't solve the family problems and would only lead to deeper depression and possibly more serious mental health issues. Meanwhile, Catherine had been researching music programs and scholarships, determined to present concrete options that might address Margaret's concerns about financial stability. She discovered several prestigious programs that offered full scholarships for exceptional students, including support for living expenses and career placement services. She compiled detailed information about successful musicians who had graduated from these programs and built stable, lucrative careers in various aspects of the music industry. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret's own mother, Charlotte's other grandmother, had been quietly watching the family crisis unfold and decided it was time to intervene. Helen Patterson was a retired nurse who had raised 3 children as a single mother after her husband died young. She understood both the value of practical planning and the importance of nurturing individual talents. Helen called Margaret one evening and asked to meet for coffee the next day. Their conversation lasted 3 hours and covered 20 years of family history, dreams deferred and dreams fulfilled, and the difference between protecting children and controlling them. "You're so afraid of Charlotte failing that you're guaranteeing she'll never have the chance to succeed," Helen told her daughter gently. "I understand wanting to protect her from disappointment and financial struggle. But look at what your protection is doing to her. She's disappearing before our eyes." Helen shared her own regrets about dreams she had discouraged her children from pursuing, thinking she was being practical and protective. She talked about watching her own creativity wither as she focused solely on survival and stability, and how she had promised herself her children and grandchildren would have more opportunities than she had been given. "Charlotte isn't asking to run away and join the circus," Helen continued. "She's asking for support in developing an extraordinary gift that could lead to any number